welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Milan. I'm a violinist who shares my life on social media, and today we're going to be talking all about how to practice orchestra music. Okay, so I wanted to create this video after I had numerous people ask me about how to practice orchestra music after I released The Art of Practice last week. If you want more of my general tips, tricks, ideas for practice sessions in general, go ahead and check out the Art of Practice video on my channel. I go into much more depth there and I talk about all of my tips for practicing. But today's video is going to be relatively short and I'm just going to kind of give my few pointers for being successful when practicing orchestra music, specifically from my experience being in youth orchestra from the age of 7. Okay, so my first huge big tip, and this is something that is so important, and this is honestly what makes me successful in orchestra, is to listen to recordings, and lots of them. This is something I talked about in my Art of Practice video, but is something that I definitely wanted to reiterate again because it is so important, especially when it comes to orchestra music. Find lots of different recordings of the piece you are going to be playing and listen to them over and over and on repeat, because that is what is going to make you the most successful, because it will help you understand how your part fits into the rest of the orchestra, as well as what to listen for while you're playing. This has saved me a lot in orchestra rehearsal by listening to recordings, because especially if you're in a leadership position such as concertmaster or principal or whatever your position is in the orchestra, it can be really nerve-wracking, especially your first few rehearsals, even if you know the music well, to know when to come in and when to cue everybody else to come in. And if you've listened to the recording, then you can listen to the orchestra around you and get a better sense of where you are in the music, and it will help you be more successful when you're trying to cue in people. Even if you're counting, which you should be, it will just help you be more successful in general. Okay, my next big tip is about how to practice orchestra music. So if you've never seen the music before and it just gets put on your stand, you get the music, what do you do? How do you start? The biggest mistake I made when I was younger was starting from the beginning of the piece and trying to practice to the end. This is super unsuccessful in many different ways, mostly because realistically, you're not going to get through the entire orchestra piece from start to end, especially as you move up in orchestra levels and you start getting longer and longer pieces of music. If you look at, for example, like the Dvorak Symphony or something really big, like a big work of music, you're not going to make it from beginning to end in one practice session or even in a few practice sessions. And what will end up happening is you will practice the beginning of the orchestra music a ton and you won't get to the end of it, and then you're really screwed when you get to the middle of rehearsal and you're 3 pages in and you haven't gotten to that music yet. So what should you do instead? You should definitely go through and look at your music before you start practicing it. Obviously, by this point, I would hope you had listened to some recordings. If not, do that first. But then go ahead and look through the music and kind of pick out those spots that seem like they would be really tricky. Usually I like to identify those spots by, is there a really tricky rhythm? i.e., are there a lot of like 8th or 16th note rests that are going to make it tricky? Is there syncopation? I also look for smaller notes, i.e., lots of 16th notes, lots of 32nd notes, lots of 8th notes, things that are really high on your instrument for you or really low, depending on what is more difficult for you. For violinists, usually it's the really high notes that are trickier. We have to put fingerings in for that. But if you're a wind instrument, I'm sure it depends on how you play your instrument and what goes on there. But just look for those sections that have either super tricky notes or super tricky rhythms or a combination of both. Once you've identified those sections, go ahead and mark them in your music so that you know where to come back to those and start practicing with those. This is where another tip comes in: pull out a metronome. I know we all hate practicing with metronomes, but this is a scenario where it's super important to practice with your metronome. Put your metronome clicking either the 8th or 16th note, depending on what the time signature is and how fast the piece is. You can refer back to recordings to kind of get a sense for that, but put your metronome clicking a smaller note so that you have a lot of subdivision, and then just practice it super slowly. A lot of times the mistake I see people making too when they're starting to practice orchestra music is they try and play it way too fast, way too soon. You should start practicing at a super slow tempo, a tempo that you really can't mess up at. And this is a different tempo for everybody. I usually like to look at the context of the piece, but I will start out super, super slowly so that I'm not missing notes and so that I can really understand how the music fits. Especially if there are tricky rhythms or tricky notes, it's really important to have your tempo super slow so you can be successful as you're learning those rhythms and notes. If you need to put in bowings and or fingerings, this is the time to do it when you're practicing at a really slow tempo. Try out some different options, figure out what works best for you and what works best in the music. If you have questions on those things, you can ask your private teacher. They can usually help you with that. If you don't have access to a private teacher or that's not something they're willing to help you with, another great option is to ask your orchestra mates when you see them and see what they're doing, and then you all can work together to figure out what the best option is for your bowings, fingerings, whatever you need to do. So focus on your trickiest section first, and then move on to the other parts of the piece that aren't nearly as tricky. You obviously should try and practice as much of the orchestra music as possible before coming to first rehearsal, but make sure you know those tricky sections really well, because it's usually pretty easy to sight read quarter notes and half notes when you're just learning it in first rehearsal, but it's much more difficult to sight read those really tricky parts. Make sure you have fingerings and bowings in your part by first rehearsal for most, if not all, of the piece. That way, when you're in rehearsal, even if you haven't practiced the section a ton, you at least know how you need to move around those notes and how you need to bow them or whatever you need to do if you're a wind instrument. I'm just speaking from a string experience. But however, you need to mark up your part so that you can be as successful as possible and make as little mistakes as possible. Okay, so what about after you've learned your music for first rehearsal? So now I'm talking after first rehearsal, you've gone in, you've played with the orchestra, you kind of have a better sense of the music, and you know the basics of your part. For the rest of the time that you have the music, you should be practicing it every day, every week, and just working on fine-tuning those sections that are tricky. Sometimes those sections are not your 10-time sections. A lot of times, for me at least, because I practice my 10-time sections so many times before I go into first rehearsal, I find that those stay under my hand pretty well, but then I find other sections of the music that maybe are simpler, but I didn't realize I needed to work on those as much. So I'll come home after first rehearsal and work on those sections. The important thing is to practice your orchestra music all the way up until the concert. This is going to make it much less nerve-wracking when you go to play your concert because you're going to be really comfortable with the music and you will have a better idea of how to move around the music and you'll be more successful in rehearsals. Okay, that's about all the tips I have for today. If you want more information or help or you have questions for me, feel free to drop them in the comments. I will answer them to the best of my ability. And let me know if you want to see me practice my orchestra music or if you want some more information on a specific topic. I'm more than happy to record a video for you guys on that. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you haven't already, please make sure to like and subscribe as it really does help me out. And check me out on Instagram and TikTok as well. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!